Welcome. Today, Chuck and Brock enjoy spending time with Professor Dominic Perler's Chapter 28, Skepticism, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. This is Generous Theology.
Yeah, it is interesting, and just going back a little bit to some of your comments, there's some truth to the idea that people they choose to use skeptical arguments, or they become skeptical primarily in areas where they already have some sense, or that's their direction. If they already have some doubt about something, then suddenly those skeptical arguments work really well. But I think it's fair to say that we know that to some extent, everyone alive has faith. It may not be faith in God. It may be other things that they have faith in. But one's worldview is really focused on what is it that you have faith in. And it is when one challenges those faith commitments with skeptical arguments that people often feel like you're challenging them inappropriately, and they get upset about those things. So it is interesting to me how that often works. People who are perhaps, as an example, not inclined to believe in a God who created the universe, they're going to get real skeptical about that kind of stuff and will criticize Christians who, to some extent, basically just take that as an article of faith. And there's ways we can go beyond that, but we take it as an article of faith that God exists and he created the universe. And yet there are, certain topics that, atheists or agnostics may take on faith as well. They don't recognize it as such particularly, but when we challenge those things, there is a sense in which, how dare you challenge those kinds of ideas? And you can be accused of either being anti-scientific or other types of challenges that one can receive. So it's important to note that no one is perfectly skeptical, and oftentimes where we choose to be skeptical is a reflection of our core faith and our core beliefs. So that's important. The other thing I was just going to mention too, just in relationship to some of your comments, I come from a background where Ventilian presuppositional apologetics, that kind of thing, was normal. I mean, that was the accepted way of thinking about those things, and presuppositionalism, wasn't particularly challenged. And, and I found that there are many Christians for whom, they don't necessarily accept that. And I've seen in recent years a lot of Christians who are much more interested in whether it's making rational proofs for God or other ways of thinking about these things. But my reading on a lot of this stuff, a lot of this philosophy has cemented for me the importance of presuppositions. And obviously, we have to be careful about how do we get those presuppositions. I think it is fair to be able to answer people's challenges to our presuppositions, but I think it also has convinced me that there is a place for that. And in fact, that's perhaps the way to go in terms of expressing what it is that we have faith in. That we just do come at it with some presuppositions that we can't prove rationally. We can talk rationally about many of the things around it, but in the end, you can't rationally think your way to God. It doesn't work that way. That doesn't mean he doesn't exist, and because certainly he does, but it is a different way of thinking about things. And this reading, I know it doesn't directly come out of this chapter on skepticism, but it's convinced me of that.
Okay, with that in mind, Chuck, I thank you for bringing that out. The professor, the author here, distinguishes between taking a skeptical position versus using a skeptical method. So this seems to introduce the concept of modeling, and we might say the analytical side of narrative and meta-narratives in philosophy. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take, for example, the existence of light. So before we come to the existence of God, we can see what a hole we humans start from just by noting some of the issues associated with talking about the existence of light. Now, I have not met a person who is skeptical about the existence of light. And so in that sense, I've never heard someone take a skeptical position regarding the existence of light. And yet, when you think about how we would want to explain or model what it is, that is to say, what light is, you can see that scientists and philosophers throughout history have taken not skeptical positions about the existence of light itself, but have taken skeptical methods or approaches to other persons' ideas or models about what light actually is. And so think, for example, today we have a metaphysical narrative around light that offers a unity of sort of two distinct models. So think of a union, light being in some senses a wave, something that moves through reality the way waves move through reality. But light is also considered in other circumstances as being composed as a particle. And so you have particles of light, or these rays of light that have location. I don't think we think they have mass yet, but otherwise, conceivably, a ray of light is this particle moving at this immeasurably quick speed. I shouldn't say immeasurably because we think we've measured it, but I want to just say that these things are not in the least bit obvious and haven't been obvious prior to the Middle Ages, when people did not know the speed of light. People who thought about it, what do you think about a quantity that moves at 186,000 miles per second, I believe? But anyway, the idea, we have to carefully distinguish between positions that we're skeptical about versus methods that we might use. So, Chuck, for example, you might be skeptical of this unity of particles and wave as being an effective model for describing what light is. And yet, you yourself are not skeptical about light's existence. And so, too, we should continue our inquiry about the nature of God, as well as the existence of God, by noticing those. So a skeptical position about the existence of God might be to doubt or reject. And we have to distinguish because, theoretically, in the abstract, me saying that I doubt something exists, we typically view that as a neutral statement. Chuck, if I'm going to throw out a silly example here, I might doubt that Finland exists. And am I reasonable? Am I not being reasonable? We can have a fun discussion about that. But if you try to introduce a method by which you wish to prove to me that Finland exists, then I may or may not respond skeptically to that method. And I loved how the professor here brought that out. And so I think we're about ready to get into some of the specifics of the medieval's thoughts here, but we really had to cover this backstory. Is there anything further that you were thinking about with respect to that aspect of it?
No, I don't think so. And I think actually that you do a nice job there then in bringing us into the first thinker here, Henry of Ghent, who, I think Perler, the writer of our chapter, it deals with some of these things too, as just a way of thinking about Henry of Ghent's thoughts about things, right? So Henry was not necessarily skeptical as a position, but he found several skeptical arguments that deal with our ability to even know things, right? So he didn't doubt our ability to know. He understood that we can know things, but he comes up with these skeptical arguments, certain civic issues of how do we know things? Is there fog, let's say, in the way that prevents us from seeing something? And if change is constantly happening, how do we have certainty about things? And so we don't really have a criteria to determine that this is a real, true, and provable thing that we've seen versus the other. And so then Henry says, so we can't then trust completely just our senses, and we need to build a second model that is stable and infallible and unfailingly presents. And then, getting back to the fact that this is still the Middle Ages, still the age of faith. He calls this the eternal model that exists in the divine mind and is made accessible to us by divine illumination, which this brings us back to the conversations we had over the past month or so about divine illumination. So I found that, this initial section just really, really helpful to, again, cement a little bit some of the discussions we've had about the use of skeptical arguments, but not necessarily skeptical positions, and how they can be used positively for us to think about our own perceptions and our own understanding.
Great points, Chuck. Thank you so much. One of the things that this ties into, that I think you're walking around, you're circumscribing the important issues here. And this is getting into the meat of one of the sections in this chapter, specifically the thinking of Henry of Ghent. One of the things that we have to wrestle with that almost seems paradoxical and yet isn't, in a way that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Henry of Ghent claims that one cannot reasonably defend the view that knowledge is possible unless one has a clear concept of what knowledge is. That's a really brilliant starting point. It also maybe makes, right from the beginning of our inquiry, this idea that epistemology starts off as being a transcendental issue. And here's what I mean. If one cannot reasonably defend the view that knowledge is possible unless one has a clear concept of what knowledge is, then how is it that one has the clear concept of knowledge to then defend the view that knowledge is possible? We almost have a chicken and egg situation. And at the very least, it points to the transcendental nature of the discussion. This is not a scientific issue at this level. We're absolutely starting in the waters of metaphysics. Now, Henry answers by indicating there are two understandings of knowledge. And I want to preface what he's talking about here with an example that I think I've shared with you before. I was tutoring a young student with mathematics, and she was having problems with addition and subtraction. And yet she was a very intelligent young lady, as will be seen with her line of questioning. We were working on her arithmetic, and she just sort of casually asked me a question. So, do you know how to do addition? And I said, sure, I know how to add numbers together. And she sprung her trap. She had clearly anticipated my answer. And so she said, okay, what is 62,567,348 plus 546,300,168? And of course, I was stumped. I think she got the better of me with that, my friend. We have to ask the question, do I really know how to add numbers together? And I think we have to consider that here for knowledge. Now, where Henry's going to go with this is knowledge in his thinking is a very certain cognition by which a thing is known as it is without any error or deception. So he's talking about, for example, knowing that 1 + 1 = 2. Now, there's the fact that one knows this, and there's also the fact that one knows something that is ontologically present. In the reality that we live in, 1 + 1 does indeed equal 2. And it's known without error or deception. Now, this is an interesting thing because prior to the proof, the scientific proof of 1 + 1 = 2, which happened, I believe, was at Russell and Whitehead in their Principia Mathematics. Is that the right place where they proved that, I think? But prior to that proof, did people who think that 1 + 1 = 2, were they expressing knowledge or were they only expressing opinion or belief? And so that's the kind of issue that Henry is raising. Now, Henry wants to start with knowledge that comes to us via sensory capacity. So you have senses, I have senses, and they work together. And so we start with individual objects, and via experience, via sensation, via reality stimulating our senses, we see how counting, generalization, things that happen to individual kinds, those kinds of events are given to our mind. And so from those individual objects and the experiences we have from them, we build these inductive generalizations. So let's suppose, Chuck, that I have a nice felt bag and I put some marbles in that bag. And I say that the marbles in that bag could be one of two colors. So there's 20 marbles that I've put in there. And I say they could be any possible mixture of black marbles and white marbles. So then I hand you the felt bag. And what you'll do is you'll shake the felt bag up, and then you'll open it, and without looking at the whole bag, you'll just take one marble out. You'll see the color of that marble, and we'll write it down, and then you'll put the marble back in the bag and shake again. And from that, over time, you are going to repeat that again and again. And your eyes are going to tell you each time you choose a marble what color that marble is. And then you're going to place that marble back in the bag so that you're drawing from a bag of 20 marbles each and every time you make a random draw. Now, what are we to think about the contents of that bag over time? Maybe after 50 times, you get some number of white, some number of blacks. Would you feel confident saying that the ratio of whites to blacks that you've drawn is a representation, an accurate representation of what's in the bag? And if not, why wouldn't you feel confident of that? And so that's the general problem of induction that we face when we start from events we can sense or perceive. How many events or individuals of a kind justifies a generalization? And so, following this Aristotelian idea, Henry wants to say that the senses assimilate the sensory forms of a material thing, and that provides the basis for a correct cognition of its perceptible features. Yet, this basic first form of cognition does not exhaust all the possibility. And so right away, we're in a quandary. One might also want to know the essence of a thing. So in other words, our senses can give us knowledge, Henry will say, of the perceptible features of a thing. But what if we want to know the essence of a thing? What if we want to know what it means to be a tree? Sure, you and I can look at an individual tree, but what is it? What is that tree-ness, if we want to use a word? What model is going to be valid and make your knowledge reputable, legitimate, justifiable? And so Henry's going to offer here one abstracts. So you have your sensory images, you've looked at trees, and after having looked at trees for some period of time and receiving enough inputs, and we have to ask how many makes enough. Of course, that's an open question. But Henry's going to say that you're going to get this acquired model. You know, from looking at trees, you're going to get an understanding, a knowledge of a sort, an acquired model, he says, an exemplar wisdom of what a tree is. And that's going to be his first foray into there. And that almost seems to be one of the universal first appeals, is this empirical alignment. Now, how do you feel about starting there, Chuck? Is that an okay place to start? Is there a better place to start? And what do you think about the possible issues associated with such a starting point?